being driven forward into an unknown land. The wind from my unknown goal strings the land. Still the question. There, where life resounds. Oh, lovely sentiment. It reminds me, and I thought about this as an invitation to worship, but it was too contemplative. Words from Ernesto Cardenal, The Music of the Spheres. The harmonious universe, like a harp, rhythms of the seasons. We are here because we sense all the rhythms that permeate our lives and the universe around us, and this is part of it. I'm here to introduce you to our welcomer today, who is also part of our 9:30 worship. I'm going to make sure I get this right. Doug Japkus, come on up here and I'll let you have the microphone. He is, are you the executive director or the founder or the father of a group called Humanity for Prisoners? Am I right in that? And he'll tell you a little bit about that as he welcomes you to our worship this morning. Doug, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I have the, good morning, thank you for having me here. I have the distinction of being the founder of perhaps the most unpopular 501c3 in the state of Michigan. And the title says it all, Humanity for Prisoners. Why? Why do we want to? Why should we? Anyway, when I explained that to your Minister for Social Justice, Jason Hubbard, he said, that's the kind of unpopular cause we like. And thanks to him and Fountain Street after that, this beautiful venue was offered to us for a fundraising concert. And now the Social Action Committee has been kind to award us a generous grant to help in our battle to improve the conditions of women in prison here in the state of Michigan, and we are so grateful for that. The question really is, though, why? Why should we do it? Why even have any consideration for prisoners? Well, let alone that they're just like you and me, they got caught, we didn't. But morally and ethically, of course, the response is we must do it. But there's a very practical reason as well. 90% of these people are going to get out again. And if we treat them like dogs when they're in there, guess how they're going to behave when they get out? And they're going to wind up back in there again. So it is very important that we do what Humanity for Prisoners is doing, a unique organization in the state of Michigan, because instead of working on the state level, we're working in all of the state prisons, but we're working one-on-one. It's the only organization that has a complete focus, one-on-one, to help prisoners, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Michigan prisoners in their individual needs and problems. I hope you'll check this summer speaking schedule for Fountain Street. I'm going to be doing one of the services in August, and perhaps you could come and join me then, and I'll be able to explain a whole lot more of it. But for now, if you would like to have more interest, check our website, please, humanityforprisoners.org. It's an honor for me to be here this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, Fountain Street Church family. As the good Reverend Dr. Wooden made mention of earlier, my voice has been lost and it's returning slowly, and just want to let you know ahead of time that although he is one of my heroes, it is not my intention on this morning to try to emulate Harry Belafonte. But from time to time, that's who may come to mind as I'm speaking. Let me begin by recognizing, giving shout out to my brothers from Villalobos and how they helped to set the atmosphere on this morning. And I think the same can be said for this wonderful choir that we heard on this morning. And for you, Brother Gene Coburn, for your direction, I just want to say thank you to all of you on this morning. And want to also say thank you to my good friend, Reverend Dr. Fred Wooden. Allow me to tell you that when I came aboard the Urban League 5 years ago, it's fair to say that we were in dire straits. And I must tell you that there has been no more consistent board member than that of your pastor. Dr. Wooden has been rock solid throughout these last 5 years. Again, when I came aboard the league, times were pretty tough, and his leadership and his presence has meant the world to our affiliate, and he's someone that I hold in very high regard, and I just want to publicly again say thank you, Dr. Wooden, for your work and for your presence, sir. It is my privilege on this morning to also recognize any preacher worth his or her salt usually brings, when they're visiting, they bring their Amen Corner. And so I've taken the opportunity to bring along with me on this morning my beloved wife, Jessie, who is here along with my daughter, my son-in-law, and my 2 grandsons, whom I affectionately refer to as my prophets. That's Isaiah and Elijah. And so I feel good, as James Brown would say, simply because I've got my Amen Corner here with me on this morning. Allow me to begin with the reading of the text that I'd like to speak from on this morning, and that's coming from the Old Testament. That's the prophet Isaiah, chapter 61, verses 1 through 11. I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. It is written, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted and to proclaim that captives will be released and prisoners will be freed. He has sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favor has come, and with it, the day of God's anger against their enemies. To all who mourn in Israel, he will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. In their righteousness, they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for his own glory. They will rebuild the ancient ruins, repairing cities destroyed long ago. They will revive them, though they have been deserted for many generations. Foreigners will be your servants. They will feed your flocks and plow your fields and tend your vineyards. You will be called priests of the Lord, ministers of our God. You will feed on the treasures of the nations and boast in their riches. Instead of shame and dishonor, you will enjoy a double share of honor. You will possess a double portion of prosperity in your land, and everlasting joy will be yours. For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. I will faithfully reward my people for their suffering and make an everlasting covenant with them. Their descendants will be recognized and honored among the nations. Everyone will realize that they are people the Lord has blessed. I am overwhelmed with joy in the Lord my God, for he has dressed me with the clothing of salvation and draped me in a robe of righteousness. I am like a bridegroom dressed for his wedding, or a bride with her jewels. The sovereign Lord will show his justice to the nations of the world. Everyone will praise him. His righteousness will be like a garden in early spring, with plants springing up everywhere. Perhaps you were not aware that the month of June is a very special month in the hearts and the minds of the African American community. It is the month of June that represents a day in history that really brought a sense of completion. I'm speaking, of course, of a celebration that's referred to as Juneteenth. June 19th, to be more specific, is perhaps the oldest holiday celebrated by African Americans. It is the grandfather of all such observances. Juneteenth is very much a cultural observance. June 19, 1865 marks the date that all slaves in the United States were officially made free. It's officially observed, as I mentioned, on the 19th. But you must understand that it was the Emancipation Proclamation that was given effect on January 1st, 1863. Juneteenth is observed to acknowledge that all slaves within the continental United States were freed at a certain point. The celebration acknowledged the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation while also acknowledging that the slaves of the state of Texas, some 800,000, did not receive the news until almost 2.5 years after the official signing and announcement was given. 2.5 years. And so on this morning, I'd like to talk with you a bit about, or talk to you from the title of Destroying the Weapons of Mass Oppression. Destroying the weapons of mass oppression. My brothers and my sisters, you must understand that 40 acres and a mule was supposed to be the resources granted to every slave to help them transition from slave to free person. And yet I realize that our ancestors did not get their 40 acres and a mule, but were mainly the recipients of one empty promise after another. However, there were those who knew that freedom for slaves must be supported by resources, because any group that had most basic resources withheld needed help making the adjustment to full citizenship and all the rights and privileges attended thereto. I, as a follower of Christ, also understand what it means to be bound, to be constrained in different ways, just as was the case with those who enslaved my foreparents. Many of us today are bound by pride and power, anger, greed, cold and unfeeling hearts, and the list goes on. I want to suggest on this morning that God can set us free from all shackles, and we see God as an emancipator and one who gives reparations in Isaiah 61. I know many a person, even those with a liberal bent, who cringe when the word reparations is mentioned as an elixir of sorts for the nearly 400-year-old case of social, emotional, economical, and physical sickness African Americans have endured. You see, there's the spiritual reparations that God declares through the prophet Isaiah, and then there's the tangible reparations that was recently written about thanks to noted author and columnist Ta-Nehisi Coates in his 15,000-word cover story that appeared in the Atlantic magazine in 2014 entitled The Case for Reparations. Likening his piece to a doctor giving a patient a bleak diagnosis, Coates stated, "We have to know what's wrong in order for there to be any healing in the first place." Then he made his case, and I quote, "Well, we have two problems. The first is, I think when you say reparations, people think you're talking about people who are long dead. There are people who are alive who have been disadvantaged and injured by policies that were in our name. The second part of that, in addition to that, that damage is such that it doesn't go away when we don't talk about it. New things happen that are compiled on top of that damage. So, segregation in a city like Chicago, a northern city. People don't really think about northern cities being segregated. But segregation in a city like Chicago creates a community of people who are ripe to be plundered when people are looking at things like bad loans, for instance. I want to suggest on this morning, my brothers and sisters, that although chattel slavery officially ended about 151 years ago, the ill effects are deeply entrenched in today's world, especially in the African American communities throughout our United States of America. As author and activist Randall Robinson once noted, American slavery was the economic cornerstone on which American wealth and power were built. Wealth and power which last to this day, as do the psychosocial consequences of American slavery, both for the descendants of the enslaved as well as the descendants of the enslavers. There was Frantz Fanon who professed that the oppressed will always believe the worst about themselves. Which brings me to my message of destroying the weapons of mass oppression. Allow me on this morning to share with you some of those weapons that have been used historically and most recently to oppress, to marginalize, to subjugate those who are disenfranchised. My hope is that you will leave here this morning with a better understanding of the need to reverse that which has occurred while discovering the role you can play in the reversal. What the prophet Isaiah has to say in the 61st chapter is part of the reason that I'm able to remain sane during these perilous times. And I can only imagine it is what kept my ancestors operating with an incomparable sense of hope. Isaiah intends to spread the good news that there is a time that's coming in which good news is coming to the poor, that relief is coming to those who have been brokenhearted, freedom is coming to those who have been enslaved, favor will replace disinheritance, there will be vengeance from the one who is all-powerful, and he will comfort all those who mourn. You see, I've not shied away from using my sanctified imagination in an effort to put myself in their shoes, the shoes of my ancestors who in 1863 and 1865 drank from the cup of freedom. And although the taste may have been bittersweet, it was and has been a cup that requires an ongoing topping off as a means of trying to right so many historic wrongs. I'm a believer that God reverses situations. And the first thing to realize is if we are bound is that God specializes in reversals. Verses 1 through 4 in the text that I read speak of how God reversed the situation of those who mourned in Zion. He reversed their physical situation. Freedom has come, and so has comfort for those who mourn. To be free was the ultimate goal, as was the opportunity to be comforted for the generations of pain, loss, poverty, abuse, murder, and to be in a constant place of darkness. He reversed their emotional situation. A crown of beauty has been bestowed in place of ashes. To cover the head with ashes was a token of self-abhorrence and humiliation. Oil of gladness instead of mourning. You see, my brothers and sisters, mourning is not prescribed for itself, but that it may lead on to something else, that it may lay a train for comfort. Therefore, we sow in tears that we may reap in joy. Holy mourning is a spiritual medicine. Now, a medicine is not prescribed for itself, but for the sake of health. So gospel mourning is appointed for this very end, to bring forth joy. A garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. A garment is a piece of clothing that you put on to cover yourself. So the garment of praise is a spiritual garment that you put on to cover your spirit. In other words, a garment of praise is a garment to put on the inside of you instead of the outside. And the spiritual garment of praise is the only one that is designed by the designer, God. The clothing of a slave was tattered, secondhand, and far from the garments worn by their masters. This verse in particular, I imagine, was especially gratifying for my ancestors. This verse gave them assurance that they were indeed important to God. So much so that he designed something especially for them and their circumstance. They could now strip away the spirit of despair and put on new clothes, a garment of praise. When I think about the spirit of despair, I give thought to some of the symptoms of depression, such as fatigue, exhaustion, tiredness, feelings of emptiness, anxiousness, guilt, worthlessness, profound sadness, lack of joy, despair, hopelessness, difficulty thinking, loss of concentration. All of this helps to validate my theory, my belief that slavery continues to have a devastating and long-lasting effect on African Americans today. Dr. Joy DeGruy explains in her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, that from the beginning of American chattel slavery in 1619 until the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, Africans were hunted like animals, captured, sold, tortured, and raped. They experienced the worst kind of physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual abuse. Given such history, isn't it likely that many slaves were severely traumatized? Furthermore, did the trauma and the effect of such horrific abuse end with the abolition of slavery? Emancipation was followed by 100 more years of subjugation through the enactment of black codes and Jim Crow laws, peonage and convict leasing, and domestic terrorism and lynching. Today, my brothers and sisters, the violations continue, and when combined with the crimes of the past, result in yet unmeasured injury. What do repeated traumas visited upon generation after generation of a people produce? What are the impacts of the ordeals associated with chattel slavery and with the institution that followed on African Americans today? You must understand that God is in the reversal business. And so he also, in Isaiah 61, reversed their past failures and future expectations. So there's something to be said about clinging to the notion that God was one who specializes in reversing situations. In verse 4 of the text, Isaiah begins to use words that resonate with those who have been oppressed. Words like rebuild, restore, and renew. For all they had to do was look in the mirror and know that they were the ones who needed to be rebuilt, restored, and renewed. Their lives and the lives of their foreparents had been devastated. And now here was an invitation to be made whole again. You know, that's all we really want anyway. Humanity, that is. We just want to be accepted as equal. In her book entitled Dignity, Its Essential Role in Resolving Conflict, Dr. Donna Hicks provided the 10 essential elements of dignity and the 10 temptations to violate dignity. And one of the essential elements is acceptance of identity. It suggests that we approach people as being neither inferior nor superior to you. Give others the freedom to express their authentic selves without fear of being negatively judged. Interact without prejudice or bias, accepting the ways in which race, religion, ethnicity, gender, class, sexual orientation, age, and disability may be at the core of other people's identities. And it closes with, assume that others have integrity. Isaiah 61 speaks to the very spirit of dignity. And my brothers and sisters, when our dignity is violated, we suffer greatly. That's why it's vitally important for you and I to build up and not tear down, to uplift and not cast down, to help and not hurt those who are being oppressed. And that brings me to my point of sharing with you how you can help and the role you can play in today's society as it pertains to helping to reverse the situation. If you notice in the text, God sent others to help with the reversal. He recruited people to help those who had been oppressed in Zion, much like I believe he did for my foreparents. It has been well documented that there were benevolent people of other races who assisted my ancestors in their ascent to freedom. This included everything from teaching people to read to helping them build schools, newspapers, and churches. Verse 5 says, "Foreigners will be your servants. They will feed your flocks and plow your fields and tend your vineyards." In other words, strangers will sustain what sustains you. I believe that the point in the text that deserves special exegetical inquiry is Isaiah 61:5. Some translations say foreigners and some say strangers. Strangers, the Hebrew word zur, means to be a stranger or to be strange. This differs from the word foreigners in the text. The word foreigners in the text, ben, refers to a people of a nation. This exegetical inquiry helped to make clear to me how God enlists people who are different and of a different nation to be a blessing. To turn this theory into practice requires a great deal of humility and self-sacrifice on the part of those who are not being oppressed. At first blush, one might assume that I'm suggesting that America undergo a redistribution of wealth. I wouldn't suggest that simply because I don't believe it could or would ever happen. No matter how popular Senator Bernie Sanders gets, and even if he's elected president, there's no way in Hades America will ever get to a place of redistributing wealth. No, I'm actually believing that the only way we carry out the true meaning of this text is through a spiritual renewal. If you recall, the chapter begins with the words, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me." And since true freedom from all forms of oppression is the goal, I also find confirmation in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, where he declares, "For the Lord is the Spirit, and wherever the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." I'm suggesting on this morning, my brothers and sisters, that we offer this help to those who are being oppressed in a way that is outside of ourselves. You see, we have a tendency to get in the way when we try and lend a hand or do so in the traditional manner of trying to justify our decisions or actions. Case in point, we can make the mistake of trying to play God by doing what we think is right and providing what we think is necessary, instead of taking a good hard look at the devastation, the history of broken systems and structures, the damage done because of racism and discrimination, and the legacy of dehumanization. It is then and only then that we will be humbled by the fact that generations of brokenness, intended and unintended, require an elixir that far exceeds human capacity. Humanity, you, my brothers and sisters, have a prominent and critical role to play, but I beg you to engage in this work of helping by committing yourself to a life of learning, humbling yourselves, and recognizing that these weapons of mass oppression are indeed real and pervasive, and that there are forces, both carnal and spiritual, who intend to stockpile these weapons in hopes of never allowing a people, a sun-kissed people who don't wear the tag of immigrant or native, to experience pure, unadulterated freedom in these United States of America. Theologian and civil rights activist Howard Thurman said, "The measure of a man's estimate of your strength is the kind of weapons he feels that he must use in order to hold you fast in a prescribed place. These weapons I'm talking about are real. Underfunded schools, longer prison sentences, an unjust justice system, housing segregation, chronic unemployment, inferior health care, and the list goes on and on. I see my role as a priest and minister, since God declared a change in my identity in Isaiah 61:6, to do as Dr. DeGruy has commanded, and that is to encourage my people, African Americans, to view our attitudes, assumptions, and behaviors through the lens of history, and do gain a greater understanding of the impact centuries of slavery and oppression has had on our people. Dr. DeGruy explains that with this understanding, we can explore the role our history has played in the evolution of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, both negative and positive. This exploration will help lay the foundation necessary to ensure our well-being and sustained health of future generations. My brothers and sisters, we need renewal to rest, rule, and abide in our city. We need to remind the oppressed that according to the prophet Isaiah, there's a garment of salvation and a robe of righteousness that's been fitted for them. Help me, Fountain Street Church, as I work to destroy the weapons of mass oppression. Thank you.